Hello everyone, welcome to this final set of videos for the analysis task you've been working on, or analysis tasks. So in this we'll start off just outlining what we're going to be doing, and then the steps that you might want to take when you're approaching interpreting your output. And then if you move on to looking at each of the videos in this section, so there's a video about interpreting the data assumptions and the output for the analysis for ANOVA, for MANOVA and for regression. And then there's a final video that kind of wraps everything up as well. So this is really just to try and bring everything together that you've been looking at. So usually how I would approach interpreting my output is to look at things like the data assumption checking first. So I might sift through the output, and for some of the analyses they're in a more straightforward order than others. But I tend to look at the data assumption checking first, think about whether it looks like my data is behaving in the right way, so that I can, when I actually interpret the output proper, I know whether I should be relatively confident with that or not. And then if I need to make any changes, so if I find the data behaving in a slightly different way or than I'd anticipated, then I would rerun the analysis and compare this second approach to my original approach and see what the differences are. So interpreting output is very much an iterative process. It's all of these analysis techniques are tools for helping you to understand the patterns in your data. So it's probably a little bit more interpretive, subjective perhaps, than you might it might be initially portrayed, statistics. But just think of it as it's a tool to help you understand the patterns in your data. And so the analysis that you initially do might not be the analysis that you end up reporting. So I normally look at the data assumption checking first, and that's really the order in which you should report your findings as well. And then I'll look at the actual results of the analysis. It's important to remember that when you're writing up an APA formatted report, that in the results section you're reporting the results, you're describing the results, so the patterns that you've identified, things around statistical significance, effect sizes, the nature of differences between groups or relationships between variables, so positive, negative, those sorts of things. But you're not looking at, you don't make statements about supporting the hypotheses at that point. You talk about whether the findings provide support for the hypotheses or not in your discussion section. But sometimes if you've got a really complicated set of analyses, actually it can help to structure the results section around your hypotheses. So you might present all the analyses required for testing your first hypothesis, for example, and then your second, and so on. So the hypotheses can provide a nice structure for the results if they're quite complicated, if you're testing more than one hypothesis, if you've got multiple analyses testing a hypothesis, for example. But you shouldn't talk about whether they provide support for that hypothesis until you get to your discussion section. So in each case, what you would normally need to do is to look at the data, to think about the hypotheses that you were setting out to test. So in each instance, you need to look at the analysis. For example, we'll look at the mixed methods ANOVA that you did, and think back to why you were doing it. So the hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 that we were testing. Now this is quite a tricky one within a mixed methods context to identify, but you need to be really clear about what are your IVs and what are your DVs. And in this scenario, the first IV was gender. So for example, and that would be a between groups element. And then the second IV was goal type. So it was whether you were asking someone to consider materialistic or non-materialistic goal attainment. The dependent variable is actually the rating of attainment. And so what you'll end up with is a main effect for gender. So if there's a difference between males and females on attainment of any goal, if a main effect of goal type, so if there's a difference regardless of gender on whether undergraduate students view their attainment of materialistic and non-materialistic goals as different. And then you would have an interaction, and that's what the second hypothesis here is about. That difference in attainment of goal type will be different if you're male or female, and we'll come on to what that means when we look at our output. But this is actually probably the most tricky of the three analyses to kind of set up, and in some instances you could even look at this within the context of a manoeuvre. I know when we saw people in the face-to-face session, people are asking whether different types of goal type and rating could be considered dependent variables in their own right, and potentially it could be. You could do this within the context of a manoeuvre, but there are reasons for doing this as a mixed methods manoeuvre, and the main one is to see that interaction between gender and goal type on ratings of attainment. So now we'll just skip ahead to the manoeuvre, just reminding ourselves about the hypotheses that we wanted to test, and being clear about the independent and dependent variables. So we've got hypothesis 1, male and female undergraduates will differ on subjective well-being. So that's actually the sort of multivariate level effect that we're trying to test. So we're saying that if we consider the three types of well-being that we've measured, cognitive, emotional and social well-being, as one big lump of subjective well-being, then we'll find a difference between males and females on the degree to which people have kind of rated themselves on that. The second hypothesis, undergraduates in the high non-materialistic aspiration attainment group will have higher subjective well-being than those in the low materialistic aspiration attainment group. Again, that's testing that multivariate effect, but this time we think that there's going to be a difference on, regardless of gender, but whether you're in the high attainment group or the low attainment group, we think there will be a difference on subjective well-being. And then the third hypothesis is really around males and females will differ on their ratings of subjective well-being, but as a function of the level of non-materialistic aspiration attainment. So it's that is the interaction effect between the variables we're interested in. And what we'd want to do with the manoeuvre is to break that down further. If we find any of these, then we'd want to see if we find that it's specifically about cognitive well-being, emotional well-being or social well-being as facets of subjective well-being. So we could break that down further with the manoeuvre. But these are all kind of looking at that idea of subjective well-being as comprising all of those three things. And so our first IV would be gender, which would be a between groups element. Our second IV, after you've done your, you've had a go at the output, generating the output, you should remember that you had to create a median split variable. So that is also categorical. That's an IV, and it's a between groups. People are either in high or low attainment in the attainment group. And our dependent variables are cognitive well-being, emotional well-being and social well-being. And the reason that we're looking at them together is that we think that they are conceptually related, that they each reflect this broader idea of subjective well-being. And now we just think about the regression then, so the hypotheses that we were testing with the regression. So the first hypothesis, gender, importance of materialistic aspiration and attainment of materialistic aspirations will predict scores on a measure of cognitive well-being. We think that there'll be a positive relationship between attainment of materialistic aspirations and cognitive well-being after we've controlled for gender and importance of materialistic aspirations. And after controlling for importance and attainment of materialistic aspirations, we think that male participants will score higher on the measure of cognitive well-being than female undergraduates. So the first one is very much broad kind of hypothesis. We think together that they're going to predict cognitive well-being. And then the second and the third hypothesis are breaking that down, and we're talking about the specific relationships between attainment of materialistic aspirations and cognitive well-being, and then gender and cognitive well-being after we've controlled for everything else. So if we're thinking about the independent variables and our dependent variable, or predictors and outcome in regression speak, then our first predictor is gender. Our second predictor is the importance attached to materialistic aspirations. Our third is the attainment of materialistic aspirations. And the thing that we're trying to predict is cognitive well-being scores. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is to work through the folder on Blackboard, watch the videos about the assumption checking, watch the videos about the actual interpretation of the output itself for ANOVA, MANOVA and regression, and then watch that final video where we'll be kind of recapping things like reporting and some of the standard practices, APA formatted reporting and so on. Okay, so have a go at those.